All right. Greetings, everyone. Thank you all for being here, joining us from different parts of the world. And welcome to the last session of Middle East Critique's course on Palestine and Imperialism. My name is Issam Al-Kourgli. I'm the assistant editor of Middle East Critique Journal and a PhD student at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I just want to state a few words as usual about the course and the journal. So as a journal, we decided to launch this open pedagogical initiative called the Ramadan Course on Palestine and Imperialism. And just for some grounding, as of a couple of days, we passed the 200-day mark of the beginning of the genocide, particularly happening in Gaza, of the Palestinian people. And there are a number of reasons of why we're offering this course. So first, this course has been put together and launched in support of the people of Palestine and their call for a global wave of action during and after Ramadan, where people from all walks of life dedicate their time and abilities to end the genocide happening in Gaza. As academics, scholars, and activists, we decided that our abilities could be best put at the service of this global wave of action by organizing an educational platform that is accessible to the general public, even more so in light of the silence and the censoring of numerous academics within public and private educational institutions that have been trying to speak logically on these issues, which is something that we will speak about, given what's happening at various university campuses across the US and many universities across the global north. Second, the course doesn't simply focus on Palestine, but it purposely aims to connect the Palestinian question with the question of imperialism, hence the course's title. There have been numerous teach-ins being organized and educational initiatives being pursued in the face of this genocide. And there are thousands of books being written and have been written on Palestine. Yet, while they all provide useful insights on the Palestinian society, most of them tend to dilute and water down the role that US-led imperialism has played and continues to play in the region, and how this is tied to the question of national liberation in Palestine. The course is also meant to ground us in a broader understanding of the political thought and geopolitical changes the region is witnessing and has witnessed. In other words, in order to understand US-led imperialism, we must understand its function and its functionaries in the region. In doing so, we invited scholars from various fields to explain the enduring relevance and intellectual necessity of picking up the philosophical tradition anchored in historical materialism to revisit the unprecedented events that we are witnessing today. So, being the last session, I'm very, very thrilled to have two of my good friends here with us today. But before I introduce them, I want to just mention a quick word about the structure of today's session. Unlike previous sessions where the speakers, they dedicate roughly 30 minutes of lecture, and then we each one respectively, and then we go into questions from myself or the audience. This one will be different in the sense that the session will be somewhat shorter, depending on how the speakers answer the question, but I'll be asking questions from the beginning to both Nina and Matteo, and they address it as they wish, and then we'll open the floor to the audience questions. Now, the second thing about the Q&A, feel free to start typing your questions from the beginning or at any juncture during the session. You don't have to wait until the end to post them, so feel free to just post it at any point. And we'll get to them during the Q&A part. So now I introduce the two wonderful speakers, Nina and Matteo. So Nina Farnia is a professor at Albany Law School. She is a legal historian and a scholar of critical race theory, focusing on the role of modern imperialism in US law and politics. Her doctoral dissertation, titled Imperialism in the Making of US Law, 1940-2008, is the 2023 co-winner of the Julian Mezet Dissertation Award from the Association for the Study of Law, Culture, and the Humanities, and is the basis of her forthcoming book, titled Imperialism: An American Story, out in early 2026. In this talk, she will evaluate the state of US imperialism today. I will also drop down shortly some of the links of her recent publications. And with us is also Matteo Capasso, who is the editor of this journal, Middle East Critique. And his work pertains to political economy and international relations. He is a Marie Curie Fellow between the University of Venice, Italy, and Columbia University in the US. And he recently published the great book, Everyday Politics in the Libyan Arab Jamahiriya, by Syracuse University Press. And I'll also share the link of his publications as well. So given the course's centrality, which is even the title is imperialism, I want us to start with this question. So about US imperialism. What is the state of US imperialism now? And is it similar or different from the fall of other empires and European powers? So please, Nina, the floor is yours, and then Matteo, feel free to chime in.
Thank you, Essam, very much for that introduction, and to Matteo and Essam for inviting me. I'm also an associate editor of Middle East Critique, so it's nice to be in community at the end of this really great series. So the historiography of the British Empire is generally, up until recently, it's been very favorable to the empire. And basically the sort of mainstream historians have said that the fall of the British Empire was much more peaceful than the fall of other empires like the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, and certainly the Germans. Which the Germans, as you know, committed the first genocide, as many of you, I hope, know. They committed the first genocide of the 20th century in Namibia, in modern-day Namibia. They also committed the Holocaust. But recently, many historians have debunked this theory that the British Empire, the fall of the British Empire, was peaceful. It was actually very, very violent. And this is consistent with what we know about the fall of empires in history and through time. The US empire is, and nobody disputes that this is the end, right? Even they don't dispute that this is the end. And what's interesting is that even though it's still strong, right? It still has its nearly 1,000 bases around the world. It's still, the dollar is still the dominant currency in the world. But if you travel continent by continent, you will see some critical weaknesses. And I think the most prominent example right now, aside from what's happening in West Asia, is Niger. Niger, last summer, the new government, the newly formed government, called for the withdrawal of the French. And at that point, it wasn't quite clear what was going on, because the reality is that the relationship of Niger to the French is not the primary contradiction, right? Niger has one of the second largest US military base on the continent, and that base is used to deploy I think the majority or some giant figure of drone strikes that the US has committed against Africa. So that is the primary contradiction. Niger's relationship with the US is the primary contradiction. But a few months ago, they said they want the US to leave. And based on news reports, it looks like the US over the last couple of weeks has agreed. And also, my understanding is that Chad has issued a letter to the US saying they also want the US to leave, which is surprising. In Latin America and South America, the US, President Maduro of Venezuela, has accused the US of building a secret military base in Guyana, which is part of the reason that Guyana and Venezuela have a border dispute right now. The US has said, we are not building a secret military base. Now, whether or not that's true, and it's likely that the US is lying, right? We are far beyond the days of the US out and out supporting military dictatorships in Latin America. The days of the School of the Americas are over. And so we're seeing a little bit of weakening, right, with the US. Another example is Haiti. They've been trying for months to send troops or cops to Haiti, to occupy Haiti. They got the Kenyans to agree, then the Kenyans backed out. They asked the Canadians to do it. The Canadians said no. They can't get anybody to do it. And so even though this is a dire situation, right, the fact that the US is continuing to try to advance this agenda, um, they're having trouble with it. So, and I'll let Matteo maybe talk about West Asia specifically, and then we're going to talk later about what's happening here on, in what we call the United States now, because I think that's also indicative of the fall.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Nina. Before I start, I want to thank Sam, who's been really there, running all the logistical part of the course. Has been really central to the day-to-day and, infrastructural needs of this course and, the setting up of the various links and pages. So thanks, Sam, for this. And thanks, Nina, for joining us today. I know there is a lot going on right now in the US. So it's on your question about what is the state of US imperialism now, it is, from an historical materialist point of view, I think that making a comparison outside of history, of the historical times, so basically looking at the US as in relation to other empires, it's not entirely possible. It's obviously, we can see because it has its own qualitative, specific aspects compared to the others. But there is certainly, what I like to stress is a certainly continuity of US-led imperialism compared to what we had before. By continuity, I mean that US-led imperialism incarnates a mode of capital accumulation and consciousness that is grounded in 4 consecutive cycles of accumulation, of capital accumulation led by the West. And when I talk about the West, I literally refer to as an entire civilization, not just one country or another. We've seen the West for 4 consecutive cycle of capital accumulation across the centuries being at the center of this, and this has created not just a material wealth in the West, in the global North, but also an ideological wealth whose results are now unfolding in front of our eyes as in this specific moment. Now, this specific moment is certainly historical moment is certainly can be qualified, as Nina rightly said, as a moment of crisis, as a moment of decline. Now, it doesn't mean that when we discuss the moment of decline, it means that we have reached a space where other social political formations all over the world are popping and are able to autonomously develop or create socialism or communism, or develop a coherent civilizational status or infrastructure for the world that takes us away from this model of development that the US has imposes. The US, and by I mean not just the US government, but US-led imperialism has imposed over the majority of the worlds. And if we go back, for those who have listened to the previous lecture already, we heard it from Dr. Ali Al-Qadri, for example, talking about the major features of US-led imperialism being related to the fact that a model of development consolidated in the global North based on the destruction, on the clobbering of the masses of the South, on genocide, as Nina rightly said. And now we are in a moment where the US, as this US-led structure, has clearly lost its hegemonic status, which obviously is related also to the material losses that it's encountering in various regions of the world, including Central and West Africa and West Asia, and obviously the rise of the People's Republic of China. So we are not living in a world, I think, anymore where the US can claim to guide the world under a Pax Americana umbrella. Basically, it cannot just bomb the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, as it did when NATO was trying to dismantle, and it did, Yugoslavia. because the period of mighty arrogance and military attack is fading away. At the same time, what we're seeing is that what me and Nina and others describe as a qualitative decline, gradual transformation of the US imperialist structure is perceived from a policy angle from those who incarnate the interest of the bourgeois, of the ruling classes, is perceived as a challenge. It's not perceived as a moment of decline. The way they are seeing this is that we are under attack. We are facing a challenge. The challenge being authoritarian governments, the challenge being terrorist attacks in Palestine, and so on and so forth. The question is that compared to what we had been seeing in the past, this is not just now. We're not living in a moment where it is one or two states that, or several, even if there were several that were challenged, that they were challenging the imperialist structure, and you could sanction them, you could bomb them, you could undertake a coup d'etat inside their countries, and potentially flip the political picture in your favor. What we're seeing now, and this is the most important, I think, qualitative change that history is imposing on us, is that this is really a systemic, it's a structural change that is connected to all these elements that we're going to be talking about more, but Nina has already mentioned in part, which is the capacity of states of the global south, of socio-political formations, to gain a space of autonomy. The moment they gain that space of autonomy, this model of development based on unequal exchange, on a material domination and exploitation, starts to find itself in crisis. And this is why we are seeing, and we need to be able to see the connection between the People's Republic of China capacity to overcome its technological dependence. At the same time, we see how the relentless support of countries like China to states under sanctions, whether being Iran or Venezuela, has created, even unwillingly, involuntarily, we're not talking about a rational connection of a global south that now is emerging altogether rationally and consciously against the north. What we are seeing, it's the creation of spaces of autonomy, the capacity of states to say, okay, now I have options. Now I don't need to go to the US anymore. I don't need to look at the West anymore. I can start developing differently in my own way. And this is really the core, I think, of the qualitative change of the structure of US-led imperialism that we are living, that we ourselves incarnate in the way we speak, in the way we look at the events that are around us. The problem is, according to me, is that the institutions that are present, that under imperialism right now, are, I wouldn't say absent, but they still largely represent the interests of the imperialist structures. There are no institutions so far that have been able to prevent the scale of mass killing, of genocide of Palestinians by Israeli soldiers. No institution in place to strike a diplomatic solution in Ukraine. No institutions in place, even in countries of the West, like states that mediate the interests for the working classes vis-a-vis capital. What we're seeing instead is the militarization of this moment of imperialism, and this is where we are left with NATO and war and violence as a flip side, I think, of the crisis.
This brings me to a second question, which has to do with the discussions about a decline of a power will always be replaced by another power, right? Which is very short-sighted understanding of power dynamics, especially they treat it as individual social relations as opposed to geopolitical ones. So my question, I guess, to either of you who could just take it first is, we notice that right now US imperialism is clearly in decline. Its hegemony is no longer being accepted as easily as it was 80s and especially in the 90s and early 2000s. So how do you expect the world order to change? So, and what does it mean to be shifting, and are we shifting to what has been commonly called a multipolarity?
So last night I did a talk that was entitled basically the end of the 500-year-old white world order. And I think what we're looking at is that. What we're looking at is the end of the European and American world order. And Matteo is right to, sort of think of it in that way. I'm not sure when Matteo said that they don't know that this is the end, and that they think that this is just challenges to their power from authoritarians. That's what they say, but I actually think they know this is the end, because of the racial panic that they've sort of advanced throughout both Europe and the US and Canada, basically North America and Europe. I mean, there's a massive racial panic right now. There are massive attacks on Black people, on all immigrants, on anybody who defends Palestinians, on LGBTQ people, on the working class, across this whole zone. And I think, I often say, Matteo certainly heard me say this, that history moves much faster than I ever think it will. And I say that as a historian, but also as a human being whose life has been influenced by these forces. So it's hard to think through what the world will look like as the decline continues. But what it looks like now, what we're seeing now, is a multipolar order, right? And the multipolar order is made up of largely non-white nations, historically racialized as non-white, who are willing to support each other, both materially and ideologically. They're not all outwardly socialist. They're not all Islamist. They're certainly not the same. But what they agree on is that they are done. They are done being exploited by Europe and the United States and Canada. They are done. And they're willing to pose a challenge to this 500 years that Ali Kadri says led to 1 billion deaths, 1 billion deaths, and the destruction of the planet. They're done with all that. So, Iran in particular, I think, is probably the most interesting example, for me at least, because Iran has, over the last year or so, or couple years, has gone from being a regional power to now nations throughout the world going to Iran for different kinds of support. Nations in Africa, nations in South America, and Russia. Russia is going to Iran for support. It's both ways, of course. It's always been that Iran goes to Russia. Certainly, Iran went to the Soviet Union. The Iranians, the leftists in Iran worked with the Soviet Union prior to the revolution. But now it's going both ways. So we're seeing the rise of Iran as a world power. Certainly, the rise of Venezuela as a regional power. The rise of China as a world power, and the rise of specific nations in Africa as regional powers, the rise of South Africa as a world power. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how all this shakes out.
Thanks, Nina, and thanks also for the remark you made, because you're right to actually point out that they do perceive the existential threat. It is true that they frame it in a way of discourse.
I could be wrong.
No, but I do believe.
Feel that way.
No, but I mean, I agree with you. It's the same in the case of what we'll be talking about, also in the case of Israel itself. I do believe that there is absolutely a rational sense that they know this is an existential threat to their political existence, to their political project. The reason why then it's presented violently as a challenge is precisely because it comes from this perception of the existential threat that is ongoing right now with the war changing. I mean, as where are we shifting? Absolutely, we are shifting towards a multipolar order. Now, the boundaries of this multipolar order remain quite unclear. It's a space where much more autonomy is being provided to countries of the global south. And I see one of the questions popping that I mean, it's going to connect directly to what I was about to say, is the fact that decline, I mean, does not mean necessarily that the hierarchy of power has changed fully. Decline means that the space of autonomy is being created. But in that space of autonomy, because that's how I call it, you know, being created for social political formation of the global south, the US does remain the main contradiction when we're looking at the world order nowadays. And it's not a question of being Western-centric or feeling that, or feeling that we are looking at the world only through the eyes of the West, and so on and so forth. The question is that the world is structured hierarchically. There are structures of power that dominate others, social political formation that are stronger than others. Imperialism, to understand that the US is the main contradictions means also that we are facing, as we were talking about before, 500 years of capital accumulation and of a white world order, which cannot be historically and materially compared to the rise of states of the global south that are now, only now, gaining some sort of technological, for example, and political independence. It is to frame the possibility to say that we have the US is an imperialist state, but we have also Russia is an imperialist state, China is an imperialist state, Iran is an imperialist state. It's a class position. What we are hinting at by doing so is the fact that we are basically making palatable the idea that in a world order where, oh, look, we are all thugs, then it's better to stay, you know, in power. Then it makes sense to go to war with Russia. Then it makes sense to go to war with Iran. Because we are presenting a picture of the world where we are all fighting together. And so we have to defend the US at the end of the day. Whereas what we're seeing now, and I think this is another key component of, according to me, of multipolarity, is not just material questions that we're facing. So the rise of new model of development in the world, the rise of new international also institutions that will have to pick up the pieces of the destruction that the US has brought upon this world, but also the fact that we need a new spiritual dimension to the world order that we are creating. So this capacity to basically link the universal to the particular. And I think Nina hinted at that with the question of, you know, they're not all Islamists, they're not all communists. This means to actually acknowledge the heterogeneity of the struggles of the world and to come together under universal umbrella of a new world order that can come up out of this. Are we at that stage? I don't think we are, obviously. We are at a stage where, and I bring back the work of Chairman Mao here, which used to say the main contradictions, I mean, the contradictions do not always need to take a certain form and shape. In this moment, war is the main form of the contradiction. Basically, we are in a stage of war and militarism. This is a stage of crisis, certainly, but it's also a stage of that is very violent and dangerous for the entire world, I think. So our focus on these wars, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Palestine, it is fundamental, because to stop this war means to stop this killing machine. This is why we need to be directly involved and capable of understanding what is happening in these different theaters of war.
I want to kind of segue into a question related to multipolarity and sanctions, and then I want to jump to Michael's question that he posted in the Q&A. But from my understanding, also that you both have expertise with the International People's Tribunal on US sanctions and imperialism, where you have documented how the functionality of sanctions to supplant third world countries, global South countries, from economically developing and leading to so much deindustrialization of the global South. So how is multipolarity potentially can help the downfall of unipolarity, or actually can help provide a more democratic global system where it's okay to choose? And here's what I mean by it's okay to choose. Libya, after 2004, the sanctions were lifted on it. Now, all of its assets, they were being freely used by the Libyan state to invest in global South countries. And so they didn't sign any contracts when it comes to infrastructure with the West. They decided to sign contracts with Russia and China to build the infrastructure in Libya. In 2008, they signed even a massive agreement for a railroad to connect all of Libya. And then what happened 2 weeks after that signing of agreement, you can even read it on WikiLeaks, I'll post a link to it, the Bechtel Infrastructure Company, which is a kind of major US company that builds a lot of infrastructure across the world, they said that despite the fact that we lifted the sanctions on Libya, Libya seems to be heading towards a different bloc, that it's not investing with the West, it's investing in the East. And this is a warning call to all the Western people, all Western countries that thought that the regime or the country was in bed with the West. So even despite the fact that Libya did not, bomb anybody, fund any liberation movements after 2004, allegedly, they just saw it as a threat that a country is just deciding to side with not the West, essentially. So can you speak about sanctions and how multipolarity can actually lead a way out of this unipolarity? Either Nina or Matteo.
Nina, you want me to go or? Yeah, okay. Yeah, what we're seeing, I mean, sanctions, and I mean, I'm sure Nina can say something about this if she wants later. I mean, we've seen the use of sanctions regimes have been a constant in the consolidation and the maintenance of US-led imperialism over the years. As you know, we organized, Nina organized actually, was one of the main co-organizer of the International People's Tribunal against US imperialism, and we did different informal hearings about the different sanctions under UN and US sanctions regimes. So sanctions have been used constantly as a form of warfare to kill, basically, to assassinate the possibility that another form of development would arise in different parts of the world. This being mostly the global South, but also countries like the USSR and now Russia. The moment we are seeing the rise of and the creation of this space of autonomy under multipolarity, which is ideological, which is material, which is even connected to the capacity of countries like China to provide the know-how to build infrastructural development to countries under sanctions. This means now that there is a capacity, there is this space created for countries of the South to finally move, get around these sanctions, and also to build alternative infrastructures that challenge the dominant ones. And we're seeing this with the creation of alternative financial institutions created by China, created by Russia, by the possibility of trading oil not anymore under US dollar, but in renminbi or in ruble. We are seeing clearly the possibility of these countries to come together and say, okay, you are going to weaponize a key element of the financial structure of the world, which is the US dollar. The moment you do so, we are going to create alternative institutions to circumvent this possibility, to say no, to say, okay, you can't do this anymore. And we've seen this with China also in 2008 with the financial crisis. China, right before 2008, the 49% of the GDP was in US dollars and US bonds and securities. The moment 2008 and China realizes that this is not an asset anymore, this can be a risk for us, the project of One Belt, One Road is launched. And infrastructure is developed all over the global South. So wealth that China had in dollars is now turned into infrastructures towards a part of the world that is not the West, it's not the global North, it's the South. this is not just about material, obviously, shifting of wealth. It also means that all of a sudden China is not looking to the north in order to create its own material wealth, but to the south, even ideologically and politically. These are major shifts. But obviously, so we're seeing that multipolarity creates this possibility. But in the process, the question of war, as you rightly know, Essam, we've seen Libya also as being one of the spearheading country in the way multipolarity grew in North Africa, was directly attacked by NATO in 2011. So the possibility that war then comes back is central. And this is why I keep saying that we need to go back and we need to reanalyze clearly what are the major contradictions in these conflicts. We can call for peace, which is important, but peace does not come out of, of nothing. There are historical conditions that brought to these conflicts, and the same happens in the Ukraine, and so it does to Palestine. We cannot compare, for example, the Ukraine to Palestine. We need to understand what is happening clearly in order to realize that the way out of this is to have a different world order in which Russia also is treated fairly by the West, which has not been happening for the past, 60, 70 years now. Sorry if I went too long.
Nina, would you like to hop in on a question related to sanctions, or?
I'll just, I mean, so the sanctions, the more severe the sanctions are against any particular nation, the more likely it is that that nation will become self-reliant. It's going to be forced to delink, right? It will have to delink by force from the global economy, which then requires it to become self-reliant. And that process of developing the infrastructure and the technological capacity and the social will, the societal will to depend on itself, that is a long process. And it takes a lot to marshal the whole society, a whole nation to withstand that. But that is what happened in Iran. And Iran is an interesting example because it got hit with one of the most severe sanctions regimes in world history. And over time, it became self-reliant. Key industries became almost completely self-reliant. And the society really developed after the Iran-Iraq War, to the point now where, as a result of the imposition of nuclear deals on the state and all that, Iran now has an active arms industry. Other nations throughout the world are going to Iran to purchase weapons. What that means is that when Israel hits Iran, Iran can engage in self-defense. And this is a massive shift in regional politics, massive. And so Niger, I believe Niger met with Iran last month, relatively recently. I don't know what the substance of that meeting was, but I suspect it had something to do with arms. Russia has been purchasing weapons from Iran. And so I'll just now shift to Russia. So Russia was also hit with one of the most severe sanctions regimes in world history after the US and NATO-led war in Ukraine launched. Russia, being the largest landmass in the world and one of the most powerful nations in the world, was able to act quickly, much more quickly than Iran. And this backfired almost immediately on the American economy, not only because of Russia's power, relative power, but also because a lot of American businesses were working with Russian businesses. They were actually closely tied together, the two economies. And so all of a sudden, a lot of businesses in the US, both small businesses, relatively small businesses, and large businesses, had to find ways to make up for this, this loss. And they're still, if you talk to business owners in the US, they're still struggling with this. So it's not just, as in the case of Iran, that sanctions backfire on a nation state basis in bilateral relations. They actually lead to to a massive shift in international politics. And I'll just plug that you should go look, if you're interested in learning about any specific countries, you should go to sanctionstrib.org. We have like 17 country hearings up there.
Yes, and thank you, Nina, for organizing that. That was very enriching. Finally, to have somebody speaking about sanctions.
It was not just me.
Exactly.
It was a group of us.
Exactly. You can check the website to see who are those amazing people who contributed to that effort. I want to kind of potentially go quickly into this topic. I know it's tangential from sanctions, but something related to those who are in the belly of the beast. As we are hearing right now, what's happening across many university campuses is that there are, called encampments, on various squares, and there are a lot of students who are disrupting classes. And then there's violence happening as well. So is the state's violent response to university students protesting against the genocide an indication of proto-fascism in the United States?
So before I'll respond to that, and I would actually be really interested to hear Matteo's response, because Matteo's also done a lot of work on fascism historically. There's a related question that somebody asked about Ali Kadri's work and its relationship to domestic, racial, and economic struggles. So the students' demands are very interesting. They're a little, depending on the campus, they're a little different than the historical BDS demands. The demand is not just to divest from Israel, but many campuses are demanding that the universities disclose their investment portfolio and then divest from weapons manufacturers. And this speaks directly to Ali's point, because in an economy of a nation state that is the world's largest empire in history, right? It's an empire that can cover that basically covers the planet. It's capable of covering the planet. And the most violent empire in world history. This economy relies on weapons and arms manufacturing. So if the universities make money, they generate income based off of the interest of their investment portfolios. And they have to invest wisely to generate more interest, to generate more money. It stands to reason that if one were to invest wisely, one would have to invest in the companies that are making the most money. And right now, with American wars waging throughout the world, I'm pretty sure that American weapons manufacturers are doing well. So the campaigns on the campuses actually are seeking to like hit at the heart of the question of empire. It's certainly about the actions of Israel. It's certainly about the genocide and ending the genocide of the Palestinians. But the students recognize that imperialism and Zionism are tied together. And they don't just recognize that, they understand the materiality of that question. And that's why what's happening on the campuses, as scary as it is very exciting. I'll let you speak, Matteo, and then we can come back to fascism, I guess.
No, Nina, I was just gonna say that on fascism, I am of the school, obviously, as Domenico Losurdo presented the idea of that liberalism, converges inevitably into fascism, is born out of fascism in a way. But we are seeing a qualitative change at the same time right now. We cannot say that, it's the US is a settler colony, obviously, and it is born out of fascism and genocide. So on that point, we know that we are witnessing, the grounds, the historical conditions under which the US consolidated as a socio-political formations drip in blood. We know that. Now, the question is, what we're seeing now is that there is a qualitative change of this, of the situation in the US. And this is important for us probably also to look back at times and think every time when the, the colonial methods are brought back in domestically. And this is very interesting now to see in the US. Are we actually seeing this happening completely? There was a question about, is the US, this new, is the US trying to reindustrialize the war economy to wage war? Partly, I think it is, but this is going to have, and it's doing so because it realizes that it cannot provide wealth to the world. It cannot treat the world fairly, by building infrastructures, but by clobbering the people and by making sure that social-political formations rising in order to challenge or to create an alternative model of development are not put into place. The scale of these wars, obviously now, is much more, the pace of these wars is, and the magnitude of these wars are way bigger than I think they used to be. And this is where we see the compression of time and the question of history is moving fast. I mean, we're seeing the war at the doors of Europe, something that the US has done, towards the region of West Asia for many years, but now it's willing to use directly countries like Ukraine in order to go to war with Russia. Even the question of nuclear deterrence now is put into question. This is what it's scary that we're seeing now. Now, I'd like to hear honestly more about the question of fascism internally by Nina, because I know she's done more research than, and she can better comment on this question, especially.
So if you look at the sort of the major theoretical works on fascism and the history of fascism and Nazism, they define fascism quite narrowly as the consolidation or concentration of power within the executive. And so when we think of fascism, right, at the colloquial level, we think of Mussolini and Hitler, by and large, and Franco, but more so Mussolini and Hitler. And they treat fascism, this mainstream continental philosophy trend is to treat fascism as a recent historical phenomenon, namely the three dictators that I just mentioned. There's another bunch of theorists that argue something completely different, and they're largely Black. So George Jackson, who was imprisoned in the United States and then was murdered in prison, Angela Davis, W.E.B. Du Bois talked about it at one point, Langston Hughes talked about it, many others. They argue that the US has been, there are differences among them, but by and large, they argue that the US has either been fascist or proto-fascist since its inception. This argument is actually consistent with Ali Kadri's position, which is that to the extent that fascism is a product of capitalism, Ali Kadri's argument is that the European world order that we're currently in, that we're seeing the end of, launched a long moment of massive violence that has destroyed the planet and destroyed much of the non-white world. And so if we don't just think about if we don't just define fascism based on how government is organized, but also define fascism at the social level of how society is organized, which is what a lot of these Black thinkers that I just mentioned do, and what Ali does, though Ali also incorporates political economy, then we can think along the lines of what somebody in the chat box said, which is that the US has been fascist since its inception. And that, in fact, you cannot have capitalism. You cannot have capitalism at this level, exploitation at this level, without fascism. But and Matteo's being very humble. Matteo has done some very good research, archival research on Italian fascism, and I think you should talk about it if you haven't yet. If you want.
I was just gonna, I thought we, since we wanted to move to the axis, perhaps we just, yeah.
You can always reach out to Matteo or even look up the things that his appearances and lectures and so forth to learn more about that. But yeah, so I think something that was also brought up in the questions is that if a bad empire, which all empires are bad, is going out, another empire is going to replace it, and some people are calling this kind of inter-imperialist. So any country that is contesting the unipolarity is also going to be imperialist, is going to be doing accumulation by dispossession on global scale, and so forth. So, and these are just very diluted, very misconceived understandings of geopolitics, in my view, and they don't see how the axis of resistance is not a new empire and it's not imperialist in any way, in my view. And I think this is going to be the topic of the discussion. I just want to kind of like maybe ground it a little bit, which is that sometimes people think that if there's a national liberation movement, and I think Matteo, you alluded to this, or if there's an anti-imperialist movement, it has to have this magnificent, perfect blueprint of principles of equality that they're going to be carrying. Like I wrote it once. Red books in the left hand, and then the arms in the right hand, and they're fighting against colonialism and imperialism. It looks just perfectly as people have fetishized and romanticized this idea of anti-imperialism. But in reality, we have to be using historical materialism, historical analysis of why does the axis of resistance look as it does right now. It doesn't look like anything that I just mentioned right now, but it is providing a ground or a leeway for us to see the world differently. So can you talk about the role of Iran and West Asia and also the axis of resistance?
You want me to go?
Yeah, Matteo, yeah, please.
Yeah. I think this is, as we said before, this is a very important question for us to understand. One of the easiest way to make this imperialist comparison is, for example, to think that all institutions are evil. So we tend to make a moral argument outside of history, which is not grounded in any material analysis, historical materialist analysis. And we tend to look at all actors of the world as inherently bad, evil, considering how much the state has been dismantled in the North, and it does not mediate anymore the interest of the working classes in the global North. It is obvious that we tend to look at all kinds of institutions here in the global North as institutions that are evil. So any actors that rises eventually is going to be evil, like the US. We cannot see beyond that. This is why this type of positions are very much prevalent amongst anarchist group most of the time. Another problem is always obviously related to the tradition of historical materialism as a philosophical tradition in the West that has seen the complete hijacking of the ideas of historical materialism through in this case should be said through a very much Eurocentric lens, because the idea was we are socialists. We created socialism. What the south of the world is doing is not socialism. We can teach them how to do it. While at the same time, this philosophical tradition of historical materialism in the West was directly reliant on the wars that were being waged into the south of the world. So you had a class of intellectuals speaking Marxism, like Zizek, who had no capacity then to question, or actually no willingness to question what NATO was doing, or actually they are directly supportive of NATO's actions in Ukraine against Russia. In other words, what you're seeing is a class of so-called academics and intellectuals that becomes really, the jesters, as Gabriel Rockel talks about, directly clowns, directly people who are benefiting from the imperialist structures. So this is part of the philosophical, of the ideological weight linked obviously to the material conditions that have allowed this the ideological way to consolidate, that allow many people in the West now to talk about inter-imperialism. The thing is that the moment we reach, if we look at the history of West Asia, we need to understand the axis of resistance through a sequence of consecutive wars that have been launched on the region. I mean, I'm on the process of writing a book about this, but what we're seeing now, if we just start from Libya, for example, if we take the three cases of Libya, Syria, and Iran, what we see is that in Libya, with the strategy of leading from behind, the US launches a war on one of the last Arab republics of the region to destroy completely the country, to throw it into chaos. 10, 15 years after, what you have is this massive anti-imperialist coup, military coup happening in Central and West Africa as a direct consequence of what's happening in Libya. Then you have Syria, the same thing has happened, another NATO-led intervention. Whatever the internal contradictions that the country had, which are important for us to understand, the moment these emerge, they are weaponized. But their direct emergence is also directly fostered by foreign forces. So, not foreign forces, by the imperialist structures. So what you see is that the creation of internal contradictions that becomes central for a direct intervention, something that obviously was discussed in I think 2 sessions ago by Louis all day when he discussed the question of anti-imperialism in Syria. In Iran, we're seeing the same thing over and over. Now, what we're seeing at the same time is that each of these countries, and I like to call them socio-political formations because they're not necessarily, at times they're not a state, at times they are a state, at times they're a very well-organized group. What we see in each one of them is a form of a strong organization that is politically bent to create a political project away from the US-led imperialist structure. Now, in the case of the axis of resistance, each of the countries belonging to this axis, each of this socio-political formation has been under direct threat or under the direct war by the US, whether it's Syria, whether it's Iran, whether it's Hezbollah, whether it's Yemen, whether it's Iraq. Iraq, I mean, is one of the most glaring cases, and whether it's the Palestinian resistance factions. So what we are seeing is so glaring for us. What we are seeing is a region that has been under the direct clobbering of the US for decades. And now, with this shifting of the geopolitical structure in place, is able to gain a space of autonomy. So when we see Russia launching a military intervention in 2002, this is directly related also. Not because I want to make Libya central because of my own work and, and me and Assam's constant conversation about it. But the destruction of Libya signals the capacity of the US to reconquer again, to go again into the region and destroy, which then marks a shift of position by both Russia and China in the case of Syria and then in Ukraine. A direct military standoff, which means a direct military intervention of Russia in Syria and also in Ukraine, is a direct challenge to US imperialism. That's what we are seeing from a military point of view. It's when violence is imposed as a tool by reality, those under the receiving hand realize that in order to undo that order, violence, counter-violence, liberating violence is an historical necessity. It's not a question of who's evil or who's not evil here. It's a question of material reality. It's a question of historical necessity that are found in the way reality develops. And the Palestinians on October 7th entered the scene of this new emerging world order by regaining their space of autonomy, by launching a military operation. Now, all these military operations that take place from Syria onwards are a direct strike to the US-led imperialist structure. And they're central, as Nina was saying, to the material emergence of this axis of resistance. The fact that Russia sells a weapons patent to Iran, and Iran produces these weapons for Russia, but also for itself. which are then circulated among the actors as in the form of know-how. And so these actors, the socio-political actors, then gain the material means to develop a different project, a political project, in which they recognize that Zionism and Israel is central to the US-led imperialist structure. So the liberation of Palestine becomes an historical necessity for the region and for all these different actors if they want to move away from the current mode of political development that they are part of, which is US-led imperialism. Nina, sorry. Go ahead, Amina.
No, that was excellent. Yeah. And I think we have other questions if you want to keep moving.
Yeah, if I may. So I think, again, so a lot of people, they tend to do this thing, be it at any conflict, right? As soon as media starts talking about it, that's when they start learning everything about it as if it's like Palestine was born or Gaza existed only after the 7th of October, Ukraine existed only after the 24th of February 2022, Libya existed only after NATO intervention to protect civilians from allegedly genocide, and Yugoslavia again. And so it's always like that. So can you speak a little bit about the role of Iran, you know, in the region, that especially how they say often people like, oh, Iran is this Islamist country, so this Orientalist narrative of Islam being connotated with evil and bad, and you know, holding civilizations from progressing. So how can those you know, respond to claims that Iran cannot be trusted, or that it is disingenuous a partner to the Palestinians and the Palestinian cause? And let me also reiterate that the Palestinian cause, please just define it. What does it mean? Instead of just thinking of this normative narrative of two-state solution, peaceful coexistence, and so forth.
It's a big question. The second part. I'll start with the question about the Palestinian cause. The Palestinian cause seeks full and total liberation. And so what that means is that the sort of, and I'm going to speak specifically about the two-state solution for a second, because at some point, right, and actually right now, people are talking about solutions to sort of get the region out of this protracted and intractable conflict. And a lot of, not only the West is proposing this two-state solution, which is actually an anti-solution, but also a lot of our friends and allies and communist parties and socialist movements throughout the world. And the reality is, the practical reality is that it is impossible. Number one, the West Bank is riddled with settlers. So the West Bank is not a Palestinian national entity on its own. It's riddled with Israeli settlers. That's number one. Number two, in this global order, you cannot have a non-contiguous state. And the West Bank and Gaza are non-contiguous. So that alone doesn't make any sense. And what it indicates is that the Palestinians should accept Bantustans, which is how South Africa was divided during the apartheid era, Bantustans. And that is not acceptable. It was not acceptable to the South Africans, and it should not be acceptable to the Palestinians, and it by and large is not. Number three, and perhaps I think the most important aspect, is that the Israelis don't want to live among a bunch of Arabs and Muslims. They have made that very clear, abundantly clear. There is perhaps nobody more against the two-state solution than the Israelis themselves. And nobody, and I'm speaking now as a Muslim or an atheist, but whatever, from a Muslim country, somebody who has family in the region, who cares about the state of the region. We should not be forced to live with somebody who's constantly trying to kill us. It's not like just having a neighbor next to you who hates you because of your race. It's having a neighbor next to you who hates you because of your race, and they're given weapons by the state, and they're told by the state, go and kill them. And keep trying until you're successful. We should not be forced to have to live like that. This is why the two-state solution is not going to work. It is not an actual solution. So that's just the sort of not short answer to the question about what Palestinian liberation is. On the Iran question, I think that's part of my answer to the Iran question is this as well. But before I respond to that, I want to say that this expectation, every time people like us, like the three of us and the other folks that have been involved in this series, speak about China or Iran or the Palestinians or South Africa or Venezuela or Cuba, most notably Cuba or Nicaragua, any country that has left the Western orbit, consciously and aggressively left the Western orbit, we are like bombarded with a bunch of questions about the problems of those projects. As if in order to leave the Western orbit, you have to be perfect. That there's an expectation of political perfection and purity and immediate change. Why don't they launch that demand against the Americans? The Americans have murdered so many people. There are snipers at the top of buildings right now at the University of Indiana and Ohio State University, the third largest university in the country, pointing their guns at teenagers who are protesting a genocide. Why isn't the demand of political purity and perfection leveraged against them? So that's, I think, just a really important point that folks like us need to keep in mind. And actually, the opposition really needs to keep it in mind. But with the Iranians in particular, first of all, historically, if you look at history, the people of Iran have always supported the Palestinian struggle, as long as it's been a struggle that needed support. So the communist movement in Iran during the monarchy very much supported the Palestinian cause. And in fact, last night, this panel that I was on, one of the panelists talked about how the first martyr for the Palestinian cause was an Iranian in the recent history. Excuse me, was an Iranian. From a state perspective, the Iranian Revolution was clearly an anti-imperialist revolution. And while there were differences among the various revolutionary factions, the women's movements, the socialist movements, the Islamist movements, all the movements, they had political differences. The one thing they agreed on was anti-imperialism. And that question for them was immediate because Iran had been devastated as a result of becoming a periphery of the US empire. The economy had been devastated. People didn't have food. Poverty was astronomical. The poverty figures were astronomical. Literacy rates were very low. Healthcare was a major problem. So imperialism, they understood to be the primary contradiction for them, but they also, as a result, understood that to include the rest of the region and the rest of the world. So you have a history of national solidarity between two national liberation movements, the Iranian socialists and the Palestinians. You have a revolution that was clearly anti-imperialist. And then now you have a state birthed from that revolution. And that state is constantly threatened by Israel. And so it's not only a matter of principle. It's not only a matter of ideology. It's now a material necessity. Iran has suffered multiple assassination attempts, assassinations on its leaders and its scientists. It has suffered massive attacks on its infrastructure, and it continues to be attacked by Israel all the time. So like, the expectation that Iran is being self-interested and that's somehow wrong is ridiculous. If somebody comes and punches me in the face and I want to punch back, am I going to be accused of being self-interested? Ironically, that's exactly what is happening to me when I speak on behalf of the Palestinian struggle. But it's just not a winning argument anymore. It's just not. I'm sorry if that was too long. I got impassioned.
No, it was perfect. Thank you, Nina. Please, before I jump to give you, Matteo, the floor, I just want to kind of ground us something that you and I have spoken a lot about, which is when we were designing this course, about the necessity of historical materialism. And again, so many people here in Libya, they're speaking about, oh, look at the axis of resistance. They're all Islamists or the Muslim Brotherhood or something like that. But, and then you have come up with some other interviews where you have spoken that where can we learn from actually combating capitalism and or standing against imperialism? Is it by tweeting about it and writing blog posts and that kind of stuff, or do we actually have to learn of how let's say Polish farmers are actually combating stuff? They're actually farmers who are somewhat fascist and so forth. They're doing something to disrupt the flow of capital, to disrupt something to get their voices heard. Maybe we have something to learn from that, right? So maybe the question to you is that how can we understand the role of Islam as it's kind of right now spearheading? Maybe spearheading is a very strong word to describe it as such, but they're very influential in the axis of resistance, in the region particularly. So yeah, please, the floor is yours, Matteo.
Thanks, Issam. I mean, I think it's an important question for us, especially for those who anchor their analytical point of view in the historical materialist tradition, philosophical tradition, because it is obvious that, especially for the ways in which we were talking about earlier, the way Western Marxism has developed across the years in the West, the question of religion is always somehow seen with a lot of skepticism, considering the ways in which obviously the same text of Karl Marx were misinterpreted or are often interpreted, we could say, especially with the idea that religion is the opium of the masses and so on and so forth. What is important for us, I think, and I need to go back to what I was talking about before, is that the moment we realize that we center the US-led imperialism as the primary contradiction of the world, of the world order and the structure in which we live under capitalism, then we see that the global South, I mean, we tend to look at the world, sorry, just let's go back again. When we tend to look through Marxism, we tend to look at the world as, the main contradictions be the one between capital and labor. Under imperialism and US-led imperialism, this turns into a North-South relationship where, the direct sovereignty of the countries of the South is under threat, basically. So the project of national liberation becomes central to the possibility of the South then to develop an alternative model of development. Now, during this process, for us, what is important for us is to understand that there is an heterogeneity of struggles happening all over the world. This means that we cannot simply apply the same model over and over in different parts of the world and expect that it's going to realize itself and it's going to materialize and it's going to bring whatever it's going to bring, socialism, communism, and so on and so forth. Different struggles of the world develop according to the ways these parts of the world, these regions of the world, integrated themselves into the imperialist structure. Now, when we look at West Asia, we look at the axis of resistance. And what do we see? We see Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah. We see Ali Khamenei. We see Hamas. What we are seeing, it is true, they are Islamic movements. Why are we not seeing communist movements? Why are we not seeing in this moment in time, we're not seeing, I don't know, secular movements fighting against Israel? Well, we need history. This is where we need history. We need an historical materialist analysis one more time of the region itself. First and foremost, we have to remind ourselves that right now, the PFLP, which is, the left-wing faction of the Palestinian resistance, is aligned directly with Hamas in the struggle. So they're fighting together and in this moment in time. And they understand this. Why? They understand this because the socio-political forces of the region have been under the direct destruction of the West and its allies. And they turned all to Islam or as a tool to weaponize, to mobilize the masses. And this is very important for us because there is a famous, not so famous actually, there is an important interview that Fidel Castro had, I think it's in the Los Angeles review of books, which I will be able to find it somewhere, where Dr. Fidel talks about how socialist movements underestimated the importance of nationalism and religion. And this is, when Dr. Fidel speaks about this, is referring to the fact that it is important to realize the traditions, the historical traditions of regions and the struggles in order to bring forward a challenge to US imperialism. Now, in the case, again, going back to the region of West Asia, what we have seen over the course of history is that secularism itself, as an ideology, abandoned completely the masses. If not abandoned, largely abandoned the masses, and turned into a bourgeois attitude, something related to the US so-called liberal agenda. So a tool of the US. We need to think of for example, of the same Palestinian Authority, the PLO, that eventually turned into the Palestinian Authority, and now it is a direct comprador of the Israeli occupation. Or we need to think of Egypt as one of the states that is so-called, secular. So we have seen how the secularism as an ideological apparatus materially started to be integrated into a mode of development of capital accumulation that was against the masses. The same thing has happened also to Islam in the region, because Islam was weaponized by the US in order to undermine progressive projects. We have to think of ISIS, we have to think of the Wahhabi project, the reactionary regimes of the Gulf, and most importantly, we have to think of Judaism. Judaism now, 95% of those who see themselves with Judaism now, they're Zionist. So Israel itself is one of the most important religious projects in the region. So what is important to understand is that the capacity of Iran and all these other actors belonging to the Axis is to re-own an important part of the history and turn it into a tool that is progressive, that is for the masses and for everyone who stands for justice. Now, in this process, obviously, we have to think that there are contradictions inside this as well. The fact that we're not leading towards the construction simply of an Islamic state, but this needs to be connected to a material reordering of the mode of development of the states. And in this process, we are now faced with the fact that we cannot simply judge whether or not they are secular, whether or not these are Islamist. This is not up to us. It's a question of how the political forces developed and used their tools in order to challenge the material reality of exploitation under which they had to live. And the question of spirituality at this point in time, as I mentioned before, considering the fascist and the complete corrupt course that the global north has gone, that the US-led imperialist structure has developed, I think is also very central for revolutionary forces in the region. The fact that you cannot just simply kill and commit a genocide like the Israelis are doing, but you need to be steadfast, you need to persevere, you need to really rebuild yourself, not just materially, but even spiritually in the process. So why are we so surprised that religion and Islam, especially in the West Asian region, is playing such a central role? Sorry for the land.
No, thanks, Matteo. I want to kind of, I know that, usually we try to cap it at like an hour and a half, and we might go a little bit just beyond that. But I have the question related to, the question that was posed by an anonymous attendee tied to the recent bill that was passed by Congress, which is $96 billion being given to the Zionist entity, Taiwan, Ukraine, and the forced selling of TikTok and how it will be banned and owned, by the United States potentially instead of being owned by another country. We know most of this funding isn't going to these places, but they go back to US corporations and arms manufacture. And we know that the arms manufacturer, they're the ones who are funding the genocide. They're the ones who are enabling it and proliferating it and also funding the reactionary regimes in the region, which is something that we didn't get to touch upon. But the question that I have is, is there an imminence of the end of the genocide of Palestinians when we look at the future from a historical perspective up to now and then the future? So please, Nina, the floor is yours.
I think I'll take the question in two parts. It's a great question. I saw it in the question box. So I think since at least World War I, since the Great Wars, the US has mobilized itself to become a war economy. And it sort of the conception of it from a historical perspective is mobilizing itself to engage in total war. So warfare all the time, virtually everywhere. This is why the police are so militarized here. This is why the US is building what's called a cop city in Atlanta. That's I think the biggest one, but there are cop cities being built across the country. There's a massive activist movement fighting to challenge it, and one person at least has been killed. So much of if you like I talked about the investment portfolios of the universities, but if you go to Silicon Valley, for example, and you look at the technologies that are being created there, technologies that on the surface are driven toward helping humanity, right? Sort of medical technologies or like computers and things that we use in our everyday lives that really are meant to advance humanity. They're being partially funded by either the DoD or DARPA or some aspect of the national security state. And if they're not being they usually are being partially funded by the national security state, and they're also being used by the national security state in their wars. So you can't. I say this, I think with some regret. It's very hard to imagine an American economy that is disinvested from war. And so when Ali Kadri theorizes that over time, he's actually very correct, because that is precisely what is happening here now. Well, one could imagine it if there was some massive social transformation and economic transformation. So what was the second part of the question? I said I was going to take it in two parts. Oh, the genocide. So I actually proposed bringing this up. And the reason that I did that was because even though there's an acuity to what's happening in Gaza right now, and the genocide, the Israeli and American genocide of Palestinians right now in Gaza, the fact of the matter is that there's been a slow genocide against the people of Palestine for a very long time. And, their calories, the Israelis counted the calories of the Gazans and allowed amounts of food in based on very restricted calories. Calorie intake, for those of you that have children on the call, calorie intake for young children, for nursing mothers, for pregnant mothers matters a lot. And it can determine the health and longevity of a child. They're not allowed, they have never allowed people to get medical treatment. So lots and lots of people, all of us that know Palestinians know people that have died of a heart attack, not because it was a bad heart attack. I mean, heart attacks are all bad, but not because it was a particularly bad heart attack, but because they couldn't, even get an ambulance, get in an ambulance. So it's always been a slow genocide. And this was one of the findings of the People's Tribunal, that what the Palestinians have suffered as a result of the blockade, in addition to the wars, has been a slow genocide. And I try to remind my friends of this often, though it's hard to do this now. But genocide is not specific to the Palestinians or to the Iraqis or to this particular moment. Genocide is a tool, it's a weapon of capital. So across time, across this period that Ali Kadri has theorized, you see genocides over and over and over again. The two things that are common are that the perpetrators are from the European world, broadly defined, right, including Canada and the US, and the victims are from the non-white world, by and large. And even when Europe committed the genocide against the Jews were not considered white. So even then, it was a genocide against non-white peoples. So at some point, I sincerely hope that the genocide of the Palestinians will end, but this will not be the last genocide until we firmly end the white world order.
That's I can only second what Nina as she's been saying. I mean, I feel that linking to the question about the latest bill that the Congress has passed and the fact that the EU similarly has completely renounced to his strategic independence and capacity also to develop I don't want to use the word de-link, but in a way to develop an autonomous path away from the US. I think we're living a moment of crisis of US-led imperialism as we started. War is the main form of this crisis, of this primary contradiction at this historical moment. The situation of the settler colony, of the Zionist entity in the region is, at least from my own understanding and analysis, is an intensified revelation of this crisis, which is why the scale of violence that the Palestinians are living is unprecedented in this historical moment, but it's always been there under capitalism, guided by the West. What we're seeing in Ukraine is similar. What we might be seeing in Taiwan is also very worrying. We are in a stage where US-led imperialism is unwilling, or is trying to do its best not to accept and acknowledge the fact that the time has come, that the world is asking to be treated fairly and justly. The world's majority is asking that. And so, while war has always been central to the imperialist project, I think the qualitative changes today is that war is becoming the primary way of extracting resources and capital. So war is an end of itself now. It's not, it's not about putting another regime or being able to control it and then creating a puppet government. It's literally destruction for the sake of destruction, because there is also no capacity to produce a political plan on a long-term horizon, due to the fact that the capital structure itself is directly orbiting, is directly locked into this bulimic time, into this dimension of extraction whose space is so fast that it does not give you the possibility to create a long-term political agenda. So war for the sake of war, this is what we're living right now in the West. And I believe that it is central not simply to have an anti-war movement at this stage, but also to clearly recognize the centrality of the role of US imperialism in these wars in order to strategize and to analyze the war and to move forward.
So there was a final question, I think, from Multipolarity, which is in the Q&A, and I think it has been touched upon in terms of the concept of inconsistencies within countries and how sometimes there's neglect. So I'll try to read it, and then if any of you would like to take it, please, so yours. So, trying to move beyond the larger contradictions versus small contradictions framing or demands for consistency. However, there are many concerns over ideas inside and efforts to reinforce some of them after much neglect. What is the significance of the demands, efforts, and concerns of various publics and civil societal state-based groups inside to recuperate their revolutionary precepts and ideals? Is there a role for them? Matteo, you're...
First, Matteo?
Nina, yes.
I can go after if you want, it's okay.
Okay. So I take the question to be asking about the question of not democracy with a capital D, but sort of the democratization, distribution of wealth. Is that correct? I'm going to assume it's correct until I see otherwise in the chat box. And you know, as somebody who, as you know, self-identifies as a socialist, I'm an anti-racist, I'm a feminist, and my work, all of my work, my activist work, my academic and intellectual labor has all been guided by these values and these movements. One of the things that I've learned over time, both from my travels and from my reading, is that it is very, very difficult to equitably distribute wealth across society, or to end the repression of women, or to definitively end white supremacy when you are constantly facing when you're on the end of the empire's guns, on the other end of the empire's guns. And it's not, I don't enter the question merely from a theoretical standpoint, even though many people have, and they've done well. But it's I'm a lawyer by training, and so it's a very practical question for me. It's what I educate my students about. And if all of your resources on a day-to-day basis and your emotional energy has to go to defending yourself in the face of guns and violence and weapons, it's very hard to make sure that everybody is receiving the right amount of food and has lots of and can just function in a healthy way. Society can function in a healthy way. So, I guess I challenge all the people who are so concerned about the women's movement and women's rights in Iran, for example. And of course, I am concerned about that as somebody who has worked in the women's movement in Iran. I challenge you to actually spend some time. And I don't know, Marco, Mr. Prado, if this was your question or not, I'm just talking broadly. But I challenge you to actually spend some time reflecting on how a society can become democratic in the face of the strongest empire in the world, when it's faced with the strongest empire in world history. I challenge people to actually think about, like, on a day-to-day basis, how do you do that? How do you allow freedom of speech when you know your society is riddled with Mossad and CIA agents? It's a serious contradiction. How do you make sure that every single member of your society is educated and has healthcare and has food and has housing when you've been completely removed from the global economy and you have to defend yourself militarily every day? So when people level this accusation against Cuba, I actually get much more emotional and upset when people level these accusations against Cuba than in the case of Iran. When people level these accusations against Cuba, my response is Cuba is, or North Korea, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The real question is not why they're not democratic and why they haven't become totally communist. The real question is how these two, small nations have survived, how these socialist projects have survived in the face of the world's largest and most violent empire. They're success stories that are unfinished. That's it, Matteo.
Yeah, beautiful point, Nina. I mean, I really like the last words that you said, that these are there are unfinished project, and it is remarkable the way they withstood the threat of war, the geopolitical, weight of sanctions, and the ideological weight. I mean, I just feel like saying the first thing that I like to say, especially on the question of, since you mentioned partly the question of women and gender, for all those who are attending, I really, encourage you to watch the session on anti-imperialist feminism that we had with Wallah Qaisia and Rabab Abdelhadi, where they tackle directly the question of how to rethink gender and to rethink feminism in a context of anti-imperialism, for example. But this applies to all this so-called, people politics, internal contradiction, and so on and so forth. Because the risk is precisely that there is an ideological part of this answer, which has to do with the ways in which and the type of concepts we use to understand progressiveness in a domestic context, which are not universal, in the sense that questions like human rights developed under NATO bombs, the ideological weight is directly connected to the material consequences of these bombs. So, like Losurdo, for example, Domenico Losurdo explains in the case of liberalism emerges in the context of slavery and the genocide of the Americas. The same thing happens to these questions of the way we approach gender, the way we approach, different type of rights in countries of the global South. If that is if we just, this idea of traveling theories, theories cannot travel unless we understand that the world is integrated into a hierarchical structure, which we call it as imperialism. They don't travel, maybe they bomb theories, and that's where the risk of certain movements at times is to really, like I explained this also in my book in Libya, where certain type of grievances that society was trying to express fall directly into the agendas, into the political agendas that were then used by NATO to bomb the country. And the consequences of the bombs, this is where we really need to be careful. So it is a massive struggle in a way. I understand that, we don't want to there is the sense that, sometimes though, anti-imperialism cannot be everything. It's not a question of being everything. We need to proceed by layers. We need to see how each of these questions is integrated with one another. If we are able to understand this, then we can definitely develop a certain type of people's politics that address the everyday concerns. But even in that type of analysis, there's going to be a hierarchical understanding of issues that, you know, are directly related, for example, to a threat to the national sovereignty of the country in certain moments. And these are developmental choices that are going to create, obviously, as we said before, contradictions, discontent in, you know, within a country. But as Chairman Mao has said many times, the contradictions do not always need to take the form of violence and war. They can even be resolved differently. And this is the whole point for us to, you know, to be able to approach them in a way that is progressively, you know, healthy for everybody.
Thank you both, and thank you all for attending this last session. I just have a quick final remarks before I close this final session. So, as a journal, when we were planning this before Ramadan, we heard the calling of the Palestinian resistance for a something called the Ramadan flood, and that is for anybody, anywhere, regardless of what your position is, academic, worker, you know, deliverer of any kind, is that you dedicate your time and any ability that you might have for the Palestinian cause and the ending of genocide. And it's very inspiring to see students right now waking up and, you know, and occupying university campuses, and so much in different places and different formats across the world. People are just standing up against this genocide. I know that this effort of intellectual stimulation, if one could call it, is only one small aspect of the struggle against imperialism, but it's still one necessary one. You know, imperialism, some people argue it walks only on 2 feet. Some people say 3, which is militarism, finance, and then also ideology. And so we're doing our part. We'll still continue to do our parts in different formats and different ways. And I hope that you all continue to do so. So I want to thank you for attending. And you can always see this session and previous sessions on our YouTube channel. And I want to thank Nina and Matteo for their time and intellect and so forth, for, you know, enlightening us and enriching us with all of their ideas and knowledge about axis of resistance, multipolarity, and much more. So thank you so much. You please do follow us, because we will have continued different projects in the near future. And take care. Peace.